So I stand before you today not as a critic, but as a historian. I'm interested in the contemporary British churches. I'm interested in what they thought they were doing when they commissioned the contemporary arts, plural, not simply visual art, but also music and various other things. I'm really interested in patronage, its context, and what the intent behind it was today. So I'll show you various pictures of various works of art, but I'm not going to be commenting on their content. Much of what we know about the record of the Church of England as a commissioner of modern art, too much, in fact, although I won't go into that now, is based on the careers of two remarkable and remarkably well self-documented individuals. The first of these is Walter Hussey, Dean of Chichester Cathedral from 1955 to 1977, and commissioner of two remarkable works on Jewish artists. Stained Glass from Marc Chagall, slide please, if you could. Slide please. And the 1965 choral work, Chichester Psalms, by Leonard Bernstein. And Hussey is here, so this here is Chagall. Could you go, there should be one before this. Yes, so Hussey is on the far right of this photo. So I've written a length on Hussey. He plays only a supporting part in my paper today, and this is because, although both of the two works that I've mentioned are significant in their way, they come, I think, late in the story of the Christian arts in relation to the aftermath of the Second World War in particular. And I'm going to concentrate today really on the period of the late 1950s, where I think the need was greatest. Next slide, please. Here's the Chagall work for Chichester Cathedral. Though Chagall fled France to the US in 1941, by the time Hussey commissioned this in the late mid-1970s, Chagall had been comfortably resettled in France for a quarter of a century. Bernstein never lived anywhere other than his native United States. So picking up on Aaron's useful distinction between the diasporic issues of this and the refugee, it seems to me difficult to gloss either of these two works in specific as a product of the refugee experience in particular, so I'm going to set them aside, other than the most distant sense. And incidentally, it's not at all clear that the Jewishness of either Chagall or Bernstein played very much part in Hussey's choosing of them to approach. So, though Hussey was the single most prolific patron of the Church of England in the period, there is another Anglican figure who exercised his influence in different, but nonetheless significant ways. He was also in that first photograph, but he's on the next slide too, please, Yuka. This is George Bell, Bishop of Chichester, from 1929 to 1957. Next slide, please. Here he is. A Feibusch portrait of George Bell from 1943. George Bell's papers reflect a vast range of concerns. Narrowly ecclesiastical, internationally ecumenical, grizzly political, humanitarian and artistic. Where Hussey's career was almost wholly dominated by his instinct for the arts, Bell's patronage was part of a wider and more integrated vision of humankind and God, the Church and the world. So it's thought that more than 300 or more painters, sculptors and graphic artists came to the UK to escape Nazi persecution. But it wasn't only artists who came as refugees. German-speaking exiles in the UK at the outbreak of war are thought to number more than 80,000. And part of Bell's concern was a basic Christian hospitality for those in need. He spoke in the House of Lords, as well as his right as a bishop, to press the UK government to modify its treatment of the nearly 30,000 men and women who had been hurriedly interned as enemy aliens, and himself travelled to see the conditions in the internment camps in which they were kept, courting significant unpopularity as he did so. It was also important that these were largely not only German exiles, since Bell had, since at least the mid-1920s, before he became bishop, had a particular interest in Anglo-German theological contact. After Hitler's rise to power, Bell was deeply involved in helping to strengthen the churches in Germany and to support those Christians from them who came to the UK and indeed often ended up interned. In public, he risked the court of public opinion in denouncing the policy of obliteration bombing in German cities. In private, he did all that he could to strengthen political resistance inside Germany. And, though not all of those with whom Bell was in contact were Jewish, the significance of the presence of many Jews among the refugees was not lost on him either. He, as has been mentioned already, had been involved in the formation of the Council of Christian Jews in 1941, although in the background. More prominent was his call in a letter to the Times in May 1942 and later in the House of Lords for immediate action in response to the emerging picture of systematic extermination in Silesia and Poland. And there was significant risk in this. Anti-German sentiment ran high in these years, and even the emerging reality of the Holocaust did not quite remove anti-Semitic sentiment in Britain. And so the position of those refugees who were both German and Jewish was particularly precarious, and there was some risk in lending them support in public. Of course, those exiled to the UK included people from many other professions than the arts, but Bell's understanding of the relationship between religion and the arts meant that those artists he encountered were of a special concern to him. The arts were not merely a pleasant entertainment, but were vital means of evangelism, some of which the Church had often neglected. But the connection was deeper and more vital even than that. Bell shared with many others within the Church a sense that an integration of religion and culture, which had been most obvious in the art of the medieval period, had been lost in more recent centuries and needed somehow to be restored. And the threat that Nazism seemed to pose to this idea of a Christian, and that is a European, not a narrow national civilization, was an acute one, but not quite new. Quote, "There is a void in the human soul," he wrote, "crying out to be filled." And the Christian revelation could fill that void. To continue the quote, "High among those who are called to interpret that revelation to a society more and more stirred by the events of the war is the artist." And so the reconstructed Christian culture that Bell thought was to come required, quote, "expression in a life of which part is contemplation and part service." And so it was the artist who could enable that contemplation. In time, of course, the internment camps emptied, but the need continued to the end of the war and beyond. Right from the beginning of the war, Bell had been aware of a dramatic recession in the work available to artists of all kinds, whether British or not. There was little appetite, it seemed, for such luxuries, and also little or no new building to decorate. In the summer of 1943, he reported still hearing constantly of artists in, quote, "entirely uncongenial work, or no work at all, longing for an opportunity to exercise their art." One such person was the sculptor Rudolf Walfried, not himself Jewish, about whose situation Bell had heard from the exiled German pastor Franz Hildebrand. Walfried had spent time interned and was now in 1943 working in a grocery store, making woodcuts of the Passion on the wood from old boxes of butter. Though Bell appreciated the work which Walfried sent him, there was nothing very much he could do at that time. Bell's most recent biographer, Henry Chandler, has noted that patronage was to him a way of life, his essential modus vivendi. It is, however, often assumed wrongly that a bishop has a kind of directive power in his or her diocese, which is far from the case in reality. The augmentation of buildings was really the province of a cathedral dean or a parish priest, the two roles in which Walter Hussey was so successful. New ventures were actually rather difficult for a bishop himself to instigate and press into completion without the active participation of local clergy. So, once in Sussex, 1929, Bell's influence, although very considerable, was less direct than it had been with the Dean of Canterbury before, and exercised nationally as well as locally. To be a patron, then, in relation to these embattled refugees, was not so much a matter of direct commissioning as the deployment of social capital, of saying a few choice things in the right ears at the right time. And one such pair of ears were those of Francis Eales, highly influential secretary of the Central Council for the Care of Churches. In 1942, Bell had been contacted by the sculptor Ernst Blensdorf, another former internee, although not Jewish, who had arrived in England via Norway. He too had worked little, getting by with some teaching in a group of Somerset schools. Bell pointed Blensdorf in Eales' direction, and Eales undertook to publicise his work in the right places. Sometimes the information flowed the other way, as in the case of Ernst Bossani, a Hungarian Jew specialising in stained glass, who had arrived from Germany in 1934. In this case, Bossani was recommended to Bell by Bernard Bracken, formerly of the Victorian Albert Museum, an expert on medieval glass. Hussey was greatly exercised by his idea for a national art service, which would support artists in the creation of sketches and designs now in readiness for the reconstruction of churches that will be needed after the war ended. Bell, taking this idea, drew it to the attention of the Central Institute of Art and Design, set up by the designer Tom Fenimore in 1940, another of the many civil society organisations through which much of English life was quietly conducted at this time. Bell also recommended Hussey to the Sussex Churches Art Council, this a Bell creation in 1942, and I believe unique in England at the time, which provided pre-commission advice and raised funds from private donors. Hussey's idea was, however, to fall flat. He had Bell's sympathy, but there was little more that he could do at the time. A similar pattern of Bell bringing into play his vast network of institutions and people is visible in the case of the German Jew Benno Elkan. Elkan arrived in England from Frankfurt in 1933 and unusually had already commissions for the church to his name before coming to Bell's attention. Their correspondence begins in 1943 and went on until the mid-50s. Now, Bell was at this time at the centre of very lively discussions in public and private about what the most appropriate form that memorials to the war should take once the war ended, arguing very strongly that the beautiful ought to win out over the merely useful. And in 1946, Elkan was working on a large candelabrum, which he had conceived directly as a war memorial. Bell travelled to see the work in progress and wrote to the Dean of St Paul's, amongst others, suggesting that he consider acquiring it. This Elkan's memorial project was, however, never fully realised, but Bell still had a part to play in perhaps Elkan's major work, the large bronze menorah outside the Knesset building in Jerusalem from 1956, which is on the next slide, although not in a very good image. This work was a gift to the young Israeli nation from British parliamentarians, but funds were raised more widely. And it was possibly Bell that alerted figures such as the Jewish publisher Victor Gollancz to the appeal. Elkan, however, thought that Christian support would also be useful. So Bell wrote to the Council of Christians and Jews to see what could be done. He also saw this work in progress a number of times, and it's in these private conversations, as Elkan recalls, that Bell seems to have been more than merely a puller of strings on the practical side. Quote, "I have to thank you most heartily," wrote Elkan, in 1956, as the completed work was awaiting shipping to Jerusalem. "Your words are very valuable to me to help me solve reaching problems of a religious character, or the appropriate way of transmutation of those ideas into visibility and possibility in a piece of art." Bell had, Elkan thought, a unique combination of scholarship, widespread religious knowledge, and understanding of the mysteries embodied in the real work of art. End quote. Bell then isn't merely a creator of space in which an artist could work, but sometimes intervened directly in its making. And it's in the relationship between Bell and Hans Feibusch, which I'll spend the rest of the talk on, that we see all of these different aspects of Bell's work together, this mixture of support, counsel, and challenge. Like Blensorf and Elkan, Feibusch saw his work seized and destroyed by the Nazis, and he fled Frankfurt in 1933 to London. Having taken British citizenship, he avoided internment and as such was available for work. Possibly as a kind of offering in thanks to the nation that had given him refuge, Feibusch was in touch with Tom Fenimore at the Central Institute, offering his services to a church free of charge. Bell was already looking for artists to engage with in the Diocese of Chichester, so Fenimore put them in contact in late 1939. The resulting commission was a mural of the Nativity, completed in the spring of 1940 in the brand new church of St Wilfrid in Brighton. Feibusch accepted only his cost and was to look back fondly on spring days spent painting during the day, walking on the promenade in the evenings. Bell left the talking about this one to the architect Charles Riley, a modernist advocate and Feibusch supporter, living at the time in retirement in Brighton. Feibusch's work, he thought, had a significance that went beyond its style. Quotes, "It is a flower of the pre-war civilization of Europe, as it was before last September. Here at St Wilfrid's, when the world is rocking on its foundations, this German artist, now fortunately for us an Englishman, has added both spiritually and materially to the things of permanent worth, and has thereby done something to offset the evils of our time. Next slide, please. I'm not missing Hussey out entirely. Here he is. Once again, Bell's web of connections began to vibrate. Shortly before the dedication of the second Feibusch Commission in Sussex, at the churches Elizabeth and Eastbourne in 1944, Bell wrote to Hussey, having heard of his intention to commission work to follow up the very recent sculpture by Henry Moore, Madonna and Child, for Hussey's church of St Matthew in Northampton. Would Hussey consider Feibusch Bell a moment? Hussey was, however, already set on Graham Sutherland, who was to produce his crucifixion for Northampton 2 years later, which is on the next slide. Hussey did, however, acquire a copy of Feibusch's 1946 book Mural Painting, and used it as ammunition to help convince his parochial church council of the Sutherland's merits of the commission. Hussey also invited Feibusch to the unveiling of the Sutherland, and the connection continued, as Methven Clark, who was Hussey's curate in Northampton and close friend, later commissioned Feibusch in 1952 for his own church of All Hallows in Wellingborough. And 3 sketches for a Feibusch portrait of Hussey were apparently made in Clark's rectory in Wellingborough. In places like Brighton, Bell could be the opener of doors and the indirect provider of funds via the Sussex Churches Art Council. But sometimes the influence was more direct. In 1950, he found himself with a gift of £200, with which he decided to commission Feibusch to paint in the cathedral at Chichester itself. The baptism of Christ, on the next slide, was completed in 1951. Next slide, please. Though almost no evidence survived relating to its making, it was clear that Bell had to fight Feibusch's corner in this case. Strictly speaking, Bell had no executive authority in the cathedral, as I've said. This was the business of the dean and chapter. And relations with the dean, Hussey's predecessor, were severely strained at this time, for reasons I could explain later if you like. The dean was instructed by the chapter to rather tersely inform Bell that they would not have accepted a painting from anyone else, but had deferred to him personally. The next slide, please. In 1954, Bell was required to defend Feibusch again in relation to the fact that for this, a mural at St Mary's, Tory by Sea, also within Bell's diocese. But the Diocesan Chancellor was unprepared to allow Feibusch to go ahead without greater confidence, he thought, that the finished work would closely match the sketches in hand, and Feibusch found himself unhelpfully unable to give any assurances that it would. Bell intervened, however, to assert the right of the artist in general to a disciplined freedom throughout the process, and the need for a certain trust on the part of the patron. Just yards from the cathedral in Chichester is the Bishop's Palace, in the chapel of which Bell had a largely free hand. In 1951, Bell was discussing the idea of a mural in the chapel with his newly appointed cathedral treasurer. This is C.B. Mortlock, through whom Feibusch had already been commissioned at St Martin's Dagon in 1948. By 1942, Feibusch was working on a design, which at this point was for a depiction of the Annunciation. Feibusch came to Chichester with a sketch to which Bell apparently expressed some reservations about which we don't know anything, about the figure of the angel. Though slightly surprised, Feibusch took the criticism on the chin and reworked the figure. The Annunciation scheme, however, also was going to depend on moving the organ, which was going to be difficult. Might there be another idea, Bell wondered? There was a major anniversary of St Richard of Chichester on the horizon. Might a mural of the saint be very appropriate in the chapel where he himself worshipped? At this point, the correspondence peters out, but the final mural, which was neither the Annunciation nor Richard, but the Ascension, shows that Feibusch somehow found another way through the various difficulties. And that the relationship between the two hadn't been damaged by Bell's interventions. Feibusch, in fact, returned Bell's check, because the mural had always been intended as a gift personally to Bell, who was, quotes, more than any good man in the world, a giver of life to me. Next slide, please. As for Elkamp, then, Bell was an active participant in the conceptual development of the works I've been discussing. But the relationship with Feibusch went deeper still than this. Peter Walker, later Bishop of Ely, knew them both and thought that they had been drawn together by, quote, the catastrophic world they saw facing them, which they were inextricably and crucially men. They could not, would not finally look away from the events they beheld, as though things were otherwise. And this note of crisis, which we hear in Bell often, also sounds clearly in Feibusch's book Mural Painting. Contemporary religious art had to, quote, avoid the baby language of stars or chubby angels. Quotes, the men who come home from the war and all the rest of us have seen too much horror and evil. Only the most profound, tragic, moving, sublime vision can redeem us. End quote. What was needed, they both agreed, was not merely a moral code, simply a way of reconstructing things. Quotes, we want fire, mystery and ecstasis, and the relationship of every slightest thing to God in some mysterious way. And I approach my conclusion here. And all of this was played out against what appears to have been a profound spiritual crisis for Feibusch himself, which culminated in 1965, some years after Bell's death, in his baptism and confirmation in the Church of England. Late in life, Feibusch recalled his family in Frankfurt as one quote, that had little Jewish consciousness. Jewishness played no role in my life. I never had any feeling for Israel or Palestine. It's hard to trace which came first, Feibusch's disenchantment apparently with his Jewish background or his attraction to Christianity. In 1941, Feibusch wrote to Bell that the Judaism he had known as a child as a sort of dead branch, while in contrast, working for Bell in Brighton had felt, quotes, as if I were on the fringe of a real community, a feeling I have never had in any of our synagogues. Feibusch had become troubled, indeed terrified, he reported, but yet attracted by the idea of a surrender to the living Christ. Perhaps Bell, he thought, would be able to read the symptoms and tell him what to do. After the war, his wrestlings continued, not least with vivid dreams of hell and judgment from which he feared he would not be able to wake. In 1952, the two of them spoke at length while Feibusch was staying at the Bishop's Palace in Chichester while painting in the chapel. And Bell at this point thought Feibusch was on the verge of baptism, but yet held back by the prospect of a public break with the faith of his background. And the Sussex connection persisted after Bell's death, in fact, right up to Feibusch's baptism in the church of St Beddes, Foster Lane here in London. And the vicar of which was C.B. Montlock again, Bell's treasurer at Chichester. And one of the godparents was Walter March, vicar of Goring by Sea. The affection that Feibusch retained for Bell, even decades after his death, which Peter Walker saw in Feibusch's face when recalling Bell's name, spoke to a mixture of practical aid, artistic and theological counsel, pastoral care, and friendship that marked George Bell's relationships with artists fleeing Nazi Germany.
Another fascinating talk with a relevant but different emphasis. Perhaps I could just say one thing which adds to further note of complexity. The one thing that hasn't been mentioned, which many of you already know, is that towards the end of his very, very young life, Hans Feibusch left the Anglican Church and I don't know if you can convert that exactly in Judaism, but he returned to his Jewish roots, which is something one might sort of ponder further. Julia, do you want to? Yes.
So I helped with the February show in 1995, and Hans came in one day and he said to me, Julia, I want to be Jewish again, I want to be very Jewish, what do I do? So I phoned up Hugo Grimm, who just said to me, Julia, it doesn't matter, we don't, he's Jewish, he wants to be Jewish, don't worry about it. So I just thought I'd share that I actually did phone Hugo to discuss it on Hans's behalf.
That might be the one I don't know whether Sarah. Sorry, go on.
So yes, I did mention that because I was only cutting material out of the paper, but it's tempting to speculate that actually had Bell not died when he did, his influence may have continued along. It possibly indicates quite how what an effect Bell had on Feibusch at a certain point.
It's obviously a very complicated issue. No single answer. I mean, it's often said, I think Paul Worth will be talking to us later on this evening, has intimated at least that it was this kind of, in old age, is increasing awareness he wasn't aware of Holocaust, but actually that past came back to haunt him more and more, and for that reason, that was certainly one reason for his return to his Jewish roots. And also, Laura, I think I'm right in saying you alerted me to a letter which he wrote to the vicar at, the church in St John's Wood. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name.
Tom Devonshire.
No, it wasn't Tom, it was John Slater, yes indeed. Where he basically says, Christianity is supposed to be richness, both as an artist and as a human being, but actually I'm able to be in the Trinity, I believe now, in the unity of God. So that is actually a more theological take on things. So anyway, it's an interesting thing to ponder, which certainly to say at that point in time, that was utterly crucial. I'd like to take that on